Excellencies, dear colleagues, good morning or good afternoon to who is with us on WebEx and to who is now joining us on Facebook Live. The Geneva Environment Network has the pleasure to welcome you today virtually for a session on building forward better prospects for green recovery efforts, discussing the support to Green Deal strategies in national and global recovery plans for the future of our planet, especially with the economic fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic. This event is organized in cooperation with the Partnerships for Action on Green Economy Secretariat, which we will refer to as PAGE. For those who still don't know our platform, we are a network of more than 100 institutions and secretariats based in Geneva that make this region one of the global hubs for environmental governance. Administrated by the United Nations Environment Programme and supported by Switzerland, we organize various networking activities, including regular multi-stakeholder roundtables and briefings on major environmental trends. Numerous actors in international Geneva are leading the work on supporting the greening of our economies. Indeed, social and economic dimensions of the global environmental agenda are one of the important areas of work of international Geneva. Concerning the pandemic that we are still facing, there is a large response from the UN system and from other actors to the current pandemic crisis. As attention turns to managing the economic fallout from COVID-19 and the roots of this pandemic to avoid future crises, national and global recovery plans will be instrumental for the future of our planet, especially in support to the Green Deal strategies announced by various member states. The recovery will bring diverse opportunities to accelerate the transition to a greener and more sustainable future. And all the guests who have joined us today work hard assisting various stakeholders as they navigate the recovery, promoting inclusive green economy plans that will create jobs and prosperity for all while reducing pressure on our planet. Today's session will be moderated by Stephen Stone, the head of the Resources and Markets branch of the United Nations Environment Programme. Stephen is leading with his team the organization work on the transition to greener economies, and he will be moderating this event, as I just mentioned. Before I turn to Stephen, let me briefly introduce you to the other members of our panel. Today we have also with us Victor van Vuren, Director of the Enterprises Department at the International Labour Organization. With us from Korea, we have Her Excellency Ambassador Hyo-yeon Jenny Kim, Deputy Director General of the Global Green Growth Institute. When we address green economy, GGGI is an important partner engaging with various institutions in international Geneva. Representing the European Union, we have with us Thibault Portevin, Green Economy Policy Officer at the European Commission in Brussels. And finally, we have also with us, we have also with us Angus Mackay, Head of the Division for the Planet at UNITAR, a key actor in providing capacity building for our planet. We have also with us Sonia Peña Moreno, Coordinator for Global Biodiversity at the Policy and Governance at the International Union for Conservation of Nature. And finally, we have with us Asad Naqvi, Head of the Partnership for Action on Green Economy Secretariat. Let me remind you that the video of this event and the presentations that will be made will be available on our website as well as the summary of this event. With that, Stephen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Diana. And again, a big welcome from me to both the panelists. Very, very grateful that you're with us today. And those of you who are listening into the discussion. I believe we all share a profound interest and also a shared destiny in how we recover from the pandemic, which has now caused more than 1.6 million deaths worldwide, probably affected a number of us. We all know people who have been affected by the pandemic and even lost loved ones. Many of us have been locked down for a number of months. Many of us have lost our jobs. Over hundreds of millions of people have lost their jobs over the past year. Global GDP is projected to shrink by 4 to 5% over the year. That's in the trillions. Some countries have suffered a GDP pullback of 30% quarter on quarter. And essentially, this is something that will be with us for a generation. And recovery will be not as quick as we think. And the decisions that we take over the next few months and years will shape the trajectory of our future economies and our future lives. So that's essentially what's at stake today. That's what we're discussing. I think we have an excellent series of panelists who are deeply engaged and committed to shaping the recovery, to make it greener, to make it better, and to build forward to the future that we need to thrive on this planet. There are rays of hope amidst the bleakness. Last weekend was Paris +5. I don't know how many of you managed to see what happened there, but many countries committed to carbon neutrality pathways in the near future as well as in the distant future. Adding to the number of countries who have pledged carbon neutrality by 2050 or 2060, such as China, Korea, and Japan, additional countries came forward, such as Argentina, Pakistan, the UK, and of course the EU also strengthens their commitment to climate neutrality. All this is part of aligning the recovery and the stimulus packages, the trillions of dollars that are being injected into economies to make them more fit for purpose for the future that we need. So to kick us off the discussion today, I'm going to turn first to Vic van Vuuren. Vic is the Director of Enterprise Department at ILO. He's also the chair of the PAGE Management Board, the Partnership for Action for Green Economy. Vic, I have a question for you, and of course, feel free to range from that question. My question to you is, governments around the world are looking for the best ideas for a job-rich recovery that leaves no one behind. What would you advise to the architects of economic stimulus packages going forward? Vic, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. You know, I'd like to just add on a few figures that Stephen mentioned, because working at the International Labour Organization, we look at the job side of things and the sustainable enterprises. You know, in the job situation, we've estimated this last quarter of this year that the equivalent of 500 million jobs are going to be lost. Over 400 enterprises worldwide have been exposed to the risk of severe disruption in the hardest hit sectors. Income and poverty, we begin to find that 270 million workers are finding themselves in extreme poverty. And from a gender perspective, we find that there's almost 510 million, or 40% of all employed, who are women that are working in hard hit sectors. So we can see the size of the problem that we're dealing with. But we must also remind ourselves that even before we had the COVID pandemic, we also had a huge social deficit. It's nothing new. And so what we've got to look at is, how do we deal with all of these issues, including the environmental challenges? And what we need to start looking at is not sitting in our respective churches, dealing with it on a silo approach. So it doesn't help that we just deal with the environment or with the economic growth or with social or with people. We need to look at the four capitals in an intertwined manner. So when we talk about building back, we talk about building back better and greener. And so we need to look at people, societies, environment, and economy. And the message from my side is that as we work with governments, the governments need to look at making sure that that is also an integrated approach at the national level. Only then will we be starting to make a dent in what these challenges are. Consequently, a recovered from COVID-19 crisis must be a better and greener recovery, and one that builds a better world for people and planet, ensuring a just transition for all and leaving no one behind. Now, that's easily said. So it's essential that we don't just have a slogan, but that we move to something that is economically and socially justified. Solid research and analysis has demonstrated that investments in key green sectors often have a larger multiplier for the economy and society and create more jobs and income than conventional investments. And that's a key to the way forward. We need to move from our current frame of mind into a futuristic thinking of what's going to be better. Typical examples include sustainable infrastructure, sustainable buildings, and retrofitting for energy efficiency and renewable energy. This is why, as part of the UN Socio-Economic Recovery, the UN Secretary General has put forward 6 climate positive actions. Invest in green jobs, don't bail out polluting industries, end fossil fuel subsidies. 4, take climate risks into account in all financial and policy decisions. Work together, and lastly, leave no one behind. Countries around the world are moving in this direction, as illustrated by the European Green Deal, which I'm sure we'll hear more about, and the Republic of Korea's Green New Deal, which we're also going to hear about today. This is highly encouraging. PAGE has been a central program of support to countries in the context of the recovery from the COVID-19 crisis angle. And recovery measures in the context of the current COVID-19 crisis present an unprecedented opportunity to fast-track progress around the world towards the future. In Africa, we have a saying, how do you eat an elephant? Piece by piece. We've got a huge challenge ahead of us, and so we need to focus on these priority areas and take it on piece by piece, and then we will start seeing a difference. We need leadership, we need long-term vision, but most of all, we need decisiveness, particularly from governments in these areas. Thank you for listening to me, and I look forward to hearing the other speakers and further debates. And thank you. I hand back to Stephen.
Thanks. Vic, some really important points that you've put on the table. The huge social deficit that we carried in from before, that's even more aggravated now with the pandemic. Where are the job multipliers, some of those sectors that bring huge job benefits, growth benefits, and income benefits, as well as environmental and climate benefits, and going beyond the slogans as well, so really reaching into the substance. Our next panelist is someone who brings a wealth of experience to this topic, both in a role of ambassador from the Republic of Korea, as well as her role as deputy director of the Global Green Growth Institute. Jenny, I have a specific question for you, which is along the lines of what you have been working on there at the 3GI. We note with interest that the Korean Green Deal and its recent commitment to carbon neutrality, how would the Republic of Korea and the Global Green Growth Institute help other countries learn from these experiences, and what can be done to build global ambition for greener recoveries? Ambassador, over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. First of all, I'd like to express my thanks to you and Paige for inviting me to this important seminar. Let me start saying that the day before yesterday, actually, Korea finalized its low emission development strategy, LEDS, and revised NDC. So both documents will be submitted to the United Nations within this year after translating them into English. It is really encouraging news. And in the LEDS, actually, Korean government reconfirmed its net zero by 2050 commitment. And the revised NDC is targeting to reduce greenhouse gas emission reduction by 24.4% based on 2017 by 2030. Particularly, Korea's new emission reduction target is meaningful because this is first time Korea changed from previous BAU-based number to absolute number. So if I say actually even before the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic, actually climate change is a huge issue in Korea, particularly in connection with air quality. You can see the two photos from my office, downtown of Seoul, Korea, which is drastically different due to the quality of air. Therefore, the GGGI, in collaboration with Korean NGO, we started the Blue Sky Net Zero 2050 campaign from 2019. And also President Moon Jae-in, he invited former UN Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, to become the chair of National Council on Climate and Air Quality, which is the highest organization to provide recommendations to the president about how to improve air quality, which is clearly related to climate action. So if I just explain a little bit about the background of Korean Green New Deal, which was announced in July this year. Actually, the ruling party, they had a strong commitment in front of the general election in April about Green New Deal idea. Also, the COVID-19 pandemic and economic crisis really pushed the government to think about how to build back better, how to ensure resilience, and how to ensure sustainable economic growth. Therefore, I believe actually there was a huge convergence of supports regarding introducing new pathway, which is green transition of the economy. So in July, President Moon, he announced the Korean Green New Deal. And so Korean Green New Deal, it is a package of huge investment led by the government, and also it is focusing on creation of jobs. So government, actually, the total amount of resources allocated to Korean New Deal is approximately 134.5 billion US dollars. And this Korean Green New Deal is composed of two pillars, Green New Deal and Digital New Deal. Actually, digitalization and decarbonization, two these are key words in Korea in addressing COVID-19 pandemic, post-COVID-19 economic recovery. Korea is a very strong ICT country, and Korea believes that based on those ICT technology, the green works will be done better and can produce a lot of synergy. So Korea has a plan to increase its investment in green area and in digitalization area in order to change the pathway and paradigm of its economy. So if we move to the details of the Green New Deal, which has three main priorities. Number one is low carbon and decentralized energy. Second, building innovation ecosystem for green industry. And third, green transformation of infrastructure. Actually, from these priorities, the Korean government is set to pursue key sectors to bring about real changes. So you can see like renewable energy, smart grid, or e-mobility, green remodeling of buildings and green infrastructure, and green innovation through research and development. Those are the areas Korea is going to focus further. So this is the expected outcome of Korean Green New Deal. So through the Korean Green New Deal, actually Korean government is really aiming at achieving sustainable and resilient economic growth. However, when Korean Green New Deal was announced, actually there were observations and views from experts and from civil society that Green New Deal is lacking clear long-term vision. So Green New Deal looks like more short-term economic stimulus package. Therefore, if Korea is really committed to achieve green transition, long-term vision, and the strategy for economic transformation must be included. That was the recommendations from many experts in Korea. Therefore, in October, actually, the President Moon Jae-in, he announced Korea's commitment to achieve carbon neutral by 2050. And after then, the governments, they also rolled out the strategy how to implement to achieve that goal. So finally, I would like to touch upon what GGJ is doing. So GGJ is closely working with the Korean government, what policy options actually Korean can take in order to implement the Green New Deal policy. And in addition to that, we are also helping developing countries to design Green New Deal-like stimulus package and also good project proposals. So we published key reports, as well as we designed project proposal for multiple funding sources. Therefore, we are helping developing countries who are particularly suffering from COVID-19 pandemic to design green projects to get an access to the finance. And finally, I would like to say that the GGJ is also working with the Korean government to well prepare the P4G summit, which will be held in May 2021 in Korea. And we believe that P4G summit is a good opportunity for like-minded countries and private sector to agree on very, very concrete actions achieving carbon neutral by 2050 and also contribute substantially to the success of COP26 in Glasgow. So let me stop here, Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. That was fascinating. And I'm seeing some reactions in the chat box as well, inspiring, very, very interesting, and also very real examples of what Vic has spoken to earlier. Some of those key sectors that you evoked in your presentation, looking at the infrastructure build out, the renewable energy, also the digital growth strategy. Really, really fascinating. And I'm sure we're going to have some questions coming back to you, Ambassador, from the chat box.
Sure.
Thank you so much for that. We're
Thank
going
you.
to move from that inspiring example from Korea to Europe. And our panelist today is Thibaut Portevan. Thibaut is a policy officer. He's in charge of the green economy and the Directorate General for International Cooperation and Development at the European Commission. He is the go-to person for green economy and green growth within the Commission. And Thibaut, my question for you today is, while many governments are relaxing the environmental and labor regulations, hoping that would allow quicker economic recovery, the EU has decided to prioritize Green Deal and green recovery as its jobs and growth strategy. Can you explain this and how to take it to scale for broader reframing of economies around the world? Thank you, Thibaut, and over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for the invitation. First of all, very happy to be here because, as you guess, the green recovery is a high priority for the EU at the moment. The EU is also a member of PAGE as financial partner, and we appreciate the opportunity to participate in PAGE dialogues. So yes, I think as you mentioned, Stephen, in the EU's response to the recovery, to the COVID crisis, the Green Deal is a pillar. It's our blueprint for the recovery. So I have to say a few words on the Green Deal to explain how we are moving forward with the recovery process. Maybe we can move to the first slide. I will start by saying a few words on the timeline of the Green Deal. As you can see on the screen, so the Green Deal was adopted 1 year ago. And as you can see, not only the Green Deal implementation has not stopped in the context of the crisis, actually the Green Deal has really driven our response. So you can see a number of initiatives adopted since last year, which reflect all the main pillars of the Green Deal. So initiatives in the areas of energy, circular economy, industry, climate change, biodiversity, food systems. These are among the main pillars of the Green Deal. And there's been a series of initiatives adopted since last year. One part of your question is how we can scale our action at a global level. And I think it's important to underline that the Green Deal has an important external dimension. Through the Green Deal, the EU has the ambition to lead by example, but also to use all our tools. So trade relations and agreements, diplomacy, international cooperation as tools to promote the Green Deal approach in the international context. We can move to the next slide. Here, I would like to present a few examples of initiatives under the recovery plan. So first, what is it, the recovery plan from the EU? On the one hand, we intend to use the new EU budget. It happens that we have a budget cycle which is just about to start, 2021-27. So a lot of the resources from the new budget will contribute to the recovery. But there's an additional instrument which has been put in place, the recovery instrument, Next Generation EU, which is funded differently. It's through resources that borrowed on the market. And here you can see examples of investment areas that are prioritized as part of the recovery instrument. I think it's interesting to see that here, again, we see a match with the areas of investments that Vic from ILO referred to and that Korea is also promoting. So investment in areas related to buildings, to energy efficiency, to transport sector, again, with the idea that these are sectors that deliver more jobs. I think for the EU, the Green Deal also, and these areas of intervention, there is also the idea that it also contributes to EU's competitiveness. The Green Deal, I think it's important to remind that it's not just a tool to support our environmental and climate objectives. It's primarily defined as a new growth strategy for the EU. And there is really this understanding that sustainability, environmental sustainability, contributes to competitiveness. So besides these examples of investment areas, I think it's important to mention the commitment regarding climate expenditure. 30% of all resources under the recovery instrument. And also targets related, it also includes targets related to other environmental objectives. You can see at the bottom of the screen a statement from the President of the Commission, and this has been reiterated many times that the Green Deal is our blueprint to guide the EU's work on the recovery. And now moving to the international level, if we can move to the next slide. So we have, through EU's internal cooperation, starting to implement a number of actions supporting the recovery at global level. So some short-term elements related to the short-term humanitarian needs, support to the health systems, and addressing the economic and social consequences of the crisis. This is where most of the resources allocated by the EU to support the response to the recovery have been made available. And I think this is also where there is the greater scope to promote a green recovery, elements of environmental sustainability. So you can see in the box at the bottom of the screen some examples, again, of initiatives put in place to support the recovery. So working with the governments, the private sector, but it's not just the funding, it is also the dialogue. For example, the EU has promoted the recovery in many events at multilateral level. Last year, we organized a démarche through the network of EU delegations to all countries outside the EU to promote EU's approach on the green recovery. So quite a lot of commitments, including at very high level, to support such a green recovery. To conclude, I would like to mention quickly the fact that, again, we promote the green recovery horizontally through our instruments, but we actually see relatively few initiatives that really focus so explicitly as Paige on the green recovery. So not just implementing a green recovery, but also advocating it at a global level. So we're very pleased to see Paige showing so much leadership in this area. I think looking at the time, I have to conclude here. So back to you, Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thibault. Again, very inspiring to see all the leadership coming from Europe and really putting into action these principles around sustainability as a growth vehicle, as a growth objective, as a competitiveness objective, but also one that lifts the entire global economy at the same time. It's very, very impressive. The other thing that I take home is that you've also identified some key sectors in the European recovery plan, the food systems, the farm to fork around food systems and agriculture. You also mentioned the circular economy, which has a lot to do with resource efficiency, materials efficiency, and ultimately reducing climate emissions. So really, really interesting. And I'm sure, again, there'll be a lot of questions coming to you on that, Thibault. I'll move to our next panelist, who comes from UNITAR, the UN Institute for Training and Research. Angus McKay, he's also a member of the PAGE Management Board, has done a lot to take PAGE to where it is today. Angus, a question for you as head of division at the Division for Planet. Developing and implementing green stimulus packages and recovery plans requires building capacity at unprecedented scale and pace. How can the world meet that demand? And what role is UNITAR playing? Over to you, Angus.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm just getting used to the mute button. I think I'm on now. So thank you very much for the introduction. And good morning and good evening, colleagues. Thank you. Excellent questions. Well, in terms of the challenge, it's 3 to 4 fundamental issues in terms of how we scale up our knowledge and understanding and skills. And the first really is that we have of the work that UNITAR does, a fairly narrow basis of knowledge globally about what the green economy actually means in practice. I mean, there's obviously a lot of aspirational rhetoric, and that isn't a bad thing, but it actually comes down to much of the time to nuts and bolts, and it's necessary for countries to be able to engage in that have been evoked already this morning nationally and also internationally, come from a very narrow base. You can probably count them. Country by country. So, I mean, for example, how do we measure a green economy? What kinds of indicators do we need to have in place, and what kinds of systems do we need in order to be able to measure progress, which is fundamental in terms of reporting back to the public, to the electors. So that would be one example. So narrow base is one. Secondly, and Vic has evoked this already, silo mentality remains a key challenge. And by definition, a green economy cannot be siloed. And, you know, engaging in with national actors, particularly at the government level, in all countries, we're often and continue to be faced with this sort of silo mentality. Ambassador Kim also referred to it. He talked about the sort of links between decarbonisation and digitalisation, and, you know, two sort of different worlds, but must come together and in order to sort of be stimulating and create the sorts of innovations that we need. And I guess the third point I would make is around the complexity, which is that we're not just talking, Stephen, about a green economy or a green recovery. There are other colours too. You know, we refer to the blue economy, for example, particularly in developing countries and in countries in special circumstances, reflecting the importance of water. And more recently, we can also refer to the purple economy, the care economy, and everything that the last year has taught us about the need for those systems of care to be put in place and to be sustained. And there are other colours as well. So it's not a green economy. It's a multicoloured economy. So this is a huge challenge. And I think scaling up understanding, knowledge, and above all, practical skills is what's needed. But the good news is that the journey has begun. I mean, I don't want to sort of put too much on what Paige is doing, although I would like to say a few words, because it's such a much larger problem or scale of problem than Paige only can address. But what I would say first and foremost, Stephen, is that we need to engage learning institutions around the world. It cannot be the old model of a few wise organizations or individuals sort of in a way kind of retailing or telling everybody else how it should be. We need to engage the entire education system around the world. And that's the reason why Paige is supporting the establishment of this Green Learning Network, which you see up on screen, which is precisely to do just that. Let's move on, because I know we don't have much time. So if I could have the next slide. A second element is around getting clear messages, getting the knowledge out there. And one of the things that Paige is doing is making this available through free online courses, but they're also adaptable to more traditional face-to-face modalities, and we hope that we will get back to that in due course. So we have a package, and this is an offer that we've been building over time that encompasses the sort of the introductory types of knowledge on what is a green economy and why it's important. But going into more interesting and specific and technical areas such as green industrial policy, the development of indicators to measure progress, as I referred to a moment ago, green economy and trade, to what extent is the green economy to be driven by international trade in the way that it has been in the non-green economy, big questions. And then very practical elements such as green fiscal reform, which go to the heart of the changes necessary. One more slide, if I may, Diana, to finish on the issue of building awareness. So I mentioned engaging learning institutions around the world, harnessing the education system, repurposing, if you like. I mentioned the content that needs to be out there, but also building awareness. And we've just launched, in fact, Paige has launched a year-long series called The Green Renaissance, a podcast series. I think it launched yesterday. So that's something to watch out for. If you have a Spotify account or SoundCloud or other platforms, you will find us there. And what I wanted to do was to sort of finish, Stephen, with evoking something which Elliot Harris said yesterday in yesterday's podcast, which is about hope, really, and how the situation is different from 2008 when these questions were raised before. And some of the things that he said is, well, you know, we should be more hopeful of green economy today because the whole cost structure is different now. Green solutions are cost effective in a way that perhaps they weren't back then. We also see huge engagement from enlightened large corporations and CEOs. That's very clear, and that's a clear difference from before. And finally, youth engagement. It's not just rhetorical. There is a handing over, if you like, of the pen going on, and I think that's very, very positive, and we should do everything we can to encourage it. So thank you for the moment. I'm handing back to you.
Thank you very much, Angus. That was brilliant. What has changed since 2008, 2009, coming into 2020, and very relevant cost structures, private sector engagement, youth on board, in a way that the writing's on the wall. And I think many more people are getting it now, that it's not just a question of an option, it's actually an imperative to see how we redirect and change course. I also want to say, Angus, that UNITAR and your team in particular has done an incredible job of innovating around learning. And that really, to me, seems to be the trick. We're innovating our way out of scarcity. We're innovating our way out of a crisis. And it's through human capital and the power of ideas that we get that done. So thanks very much for sharing that, Angus. So I go to now our fifth panelist, who is coming from IUCN. She is Sonia Peña Moreno. She's the coordinator of the Global Biodiversity Policy and Governance Program at IUCN. And Sonia, the question to you is, due to economic impacts of COVID-19, a number of countries are struggling to service their debt. How do you see an interface between debt and nature-based solutions for a green economic recovery? Over to you, Sonia.
Thank you, Stephen. Good morning, everyone. Before going into your question or addressing it, Stephen, I would like to just briefly introduce today a new initiative that IUCN has been committing to and launched recently that is looking precisely at how we integrate and ensure that nature-based solutions and nature is integrated forcefully into the recovery plans. So next slide, please. I don't think that I have to go into the whole context. We know and we heard it from the previous speakers before, but I think it's good for us to start, reflecting on the words that the Secretary General mentioned a few weeks ago. I think it was on the 2nd of December in his speech to the Columbia University, where he said that actually the recovery, post-COVID recovery, and our planet's repair can be actually two sides of the same coin. We don't have to see all these efforts, going into different directions or being siloed apart. Next slide, please. So the COVID pandemic has actually forced us all to rethink the status quo, how we consume, how we behave, and has opened the door for sustained investments in nature-based solutions to be part of the actual recovery. So moving forward, incorporating nature and nature-based solutions into social and economic decisions should and can become the new normal. We know that when applied properly and when done properly, nature-based solutions can create positive change that is sustainable over time, that is inclusive, that is cost-effective across a range of sectors and societal challenges. Next slide. So the case for nature, I think it's clear. It just perhaps needs strengthening and highlighting that investing in nature is good in terms of jobs, as we already heard today, reducing vulnerability and increasing community resilience, tackling biodiversity and climate together, jointly, and obviously constituting a basis for the application or the fulfillment of the Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide. I think, and this was also briefly alluded in the previous presentations from the previous speakers, I think that the figures are there and back our claims up. It's just the question perhaps of compiling them and making them available and better known to those that are taking those decisions in terms of the recovery plans. So we must build on the evidence that we have to continue to emphasize how nature can be an ally and must be part of the solution, not only to the COVID crisis, but also to the biodiversity loss and climate crisis. Next, please. So I think that we really have no time to lose. Strong measures to cushion the impacts of the pandemic are already being taken, amounting to trillions, I think it is 12 or 13 trillions of US dollars globally, according to the IMF. So governments and investors, I think, need the knowledge that we have, the support and the encouragement that we can provide to go into the right direction and move us into the right direction. Next slide. So what is IUCN's ambition with this new initiative? It's very simple: to simply ensure that post-COVID investments are effectively directed to nature-based recovery. And more specifically, next slide, please. That is divided in two main objectives. One, that economic investment in the post-COVID world does no harm, no additional harm to nature and livelihoods. And the second part, that at least 10% of the overall recovery investment is not only directed to nature, but also adds value to nature. Next slide. So how do we want to do that? Over the next year or so, we want to concentrate our work in three different areas. One is furthering the understanding of nature-based solutions and defining, I think, nature-based recovery. What does it mean? How reinforcing the knowledge that we already have, the knowledge base, setting indicators to measure impacts on nature, the indicators that were just previously mentioned by Angus. I think it is important that we work in that direction. And here, the recently released nature-based solutions standard from IUCN will help us guide, in that measuring what is actually considered a nature-based solution and what cannot be, considered as a nature-based solution. So it provides like a typology of sorts. And in the second area, assessing financial investments, we want to take a similar approach, defining what are the investments, what is being proposed in those packages overall, and what is going to nature, what is qualified as being green, and really understanding what the green means. Because so far what we've seen, what is proposed and labeled as green is mostly dedicated to tackling climate change, but not necessarily biodiversity loss or environmental challenges more broadly. So that we want to work on that area. And the third area of work is more engaging with IUCN members primarily, and also with partners like all of us today in the call, in nature-based recovery, to really push for this ambition to be met. Next slide, please. So why IUCN? I'm not going to go into defining why IUCN is uniquely positioned, but I think that we have what it takes in terms of a worldwide network of members that come from government agencies, states, and NGOs, big and small, and indigenous peoples organizations. So we have a broad variety of members to engage with, to provide this push into the nature-based recovery world. We have the knowledge, we have the expertise, so we are well positioned to work with you all on this effort. Next slide. So we we must build on the momentum that is being created. You alluded to that at the beginning, Stephen, and some others mentioned the Paris Agreement, the 5 years of the Paris Agreement, and everything that has been happening. This year was supposed to be the 2020, the year of biodiversity, and we were hit hard by the pandemic. Now, next year, we're seeing it as another, super year for biodiversity. Let's see how that plays out. But we must use like that catalyzing moment to work on those efforts and ensure that recovery is actually based on nature. Our one bit of publicity, our Congress, the IUCN World Conservation Congress, that was postponed from this June to then January next year, and now was again postponed, now has been set again for dates of the 3rd to the 11th of September 2021 in Marseille, in France. This has been agreed with the host country. Let's see what happens from here to there, but that will be a very, very big opportunity to keep on working on this effort. Now, I think there's one more slide, just simply to say that this initiative is part of a wider set of initiatives that the new Director General of IUCN, Dr. Bruno Oberle, has put in place as part of his vision of where IUCN should be heading in the next years to come. Now, I think there's one more just to say thank you, but just to go back to your question, Stephen, on the issue of death and nature-based solutions, I think that finding ways to reduce the debt burden of developing countries is essential. It's really important, but I don't think that debt forgiveness is the way to go, is the solution. But rather, as we have been hearing this morning, countries need income, need jobs, need tax revenue to find their way out of the economic trouble in which we're in. And here, I think, is where we must stress that the nature-based solutions become interesting and a very good way forward. We must also challenge the idea or the assumption that going into green investments is a luxury that comes after all the other economic and development needs are met. It is not. It is something that can come hand in hand and actually provides a good opportunity to go in the right direction, and is less expensive than most of the more traditional and conventional approaches to economic growth. So we would actually, or should actually, use the data and the information we have to really press on those facts and figures, and demonstrate that we can create more jobs that are easily, reachable, that are low skill, perhaps, that those developing countries that are finding their way out of debt and economic recovery can get hold on and provide additional benefits to nature. There are other things that we could perhaps touch upon, but I think that my time is over now, and maybe we could leave it for a further discussion. Back to you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Sonia. No, thank you for coming back to the question. And in a way, your entire presentation was answering the question as well, showing the linkage between the investment side, the debt that we have to nature, the source of all life, and how we draw upon nature to create wealth, and in some cases sustainably, and in some cases unsustainably.
Exactly.
Also reflect on the Year of Nature, because at UNEP, of course, with Inga Anderson taking the helm of UNEP some years ago from IUCN, she, of course, championed the Year of Nature. And I think for all of us, it was a lateral hit. We really got hit with COVID-19. But as Inga has said, this is a message from nature. This is happening because we've squeezed habitats so tremendously that the zoonoses are increasing. So thanks very much for that, Sonia. And I see some questions that are popping up for you already, so you can think about some of them in the chat box when I come back to you. Our last panelist today is Asad Naqvi. He's the head of the PAGE Secretariat. He's been with the Partnership for Action for Green Economy for many years now, leading it to new heights. And Asad, the question I have for you is, PAGE was one of the first UN partnerships to start supporting countries on the greening of economic recovery. Can you tell us what are the best practices and lessons that are emerging so far? And what do you make for prospects of greening recovery efforts going forward? Assad, over to you.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you all the panelists. It's a pleasure to join this very distinguished panel today. And what Stephen has not mentioned for the information of all the audience is that Stephen is also a member of the Page Management Board. So you have the three architects of what Page is doing and delivering on this panel today. And then Korea and EU are the funding partners of Page, 2 out of the 8 funding partners that we have. So thank you so much for this opportunity, Stephen and colleagues, and especially to Jen for organizing the event. I think in terms of looking back and best practicing, a few things come to my mind. And if we can go to the slides, then we can move them along. So the first thing that was really good, we felt, was the management board decision to come out very early on and assure our funding partners as well as our country partners that the policy and investment decisions taken today in response to COVID-19 will be decisive whether future risks to human development are eliminated or amplified. And I think that question is still very valid even today, that it's the policy and investment decisions which will decide whether our decision on nature or future on climate, etc., those threats are amplified or not. The second step that we took, I think, which was also very useful, again, thanks to all the partners, was to inform the UN response that, the UN response has to be green and inclusive. I think it was already very strong on socioeconomic side, and the environmental side was slightly weaker, I would say, and that was the contribution which made Page. And then Page was mentioned as probably the only partnership of the UN which will support on green stimulus packages. Of course, it led to the guidance to the country team, or to all UN country teams, on economic transformation, which called for this focus on building the ecological foundations of economy, where the nature and the climate discussions came together. And of course, there were other elements on future of work, which I think Vic has very well covered. So there was one thing which is that corporate response has to be green. Next slide, please. The second thing was that, our country partners and governments will need tools. And tools are not for only environmental sustainability, but the tools are for creating jobs, creating growth, and surviving enterprises to go through this difficult time. So that was one thing which we came out very early on, that, okay, here are your green jobs, green economy, green enterprises assessment tools that you can use to see which option is best for greening of economy in your country context, with the resources, with the human resources, financial resources you have. But also we provided global data to our partner countries, which was the observatory, which was showing that what is the impact of COVID on key green economy indicators and how you can come out of them in a green and inclusive way that leaves no one behind. We created a whole hub where the information from all 5 UN agencies was put together. Next slide, please. The third was the global modeling was needed. So we started working on a global model to compare what is the business as usual recovery will look like, which probably, as Angus was saying, compare 2008 recovery and now, because the things have changed, and what are the policy lessons that can be drawn. But also then to inform and influence the global policymakers that, yes, this is an opportunity. It's a crisis, but there is an opportunity in this crisis. So at the high-level political forum, we brought 4 ministers together. Inger Anderson has been talking to different partners on green recovery. And Korea has been one of those who came forward very recently and joined a new agreement with Page, as you see in this picture. So that was the fourth thing, that we need to bring the whole family together. Then the fifth one was financing part. I think that was the big question that was coming from how do you finance? And that's where then we realigned our capacity building. Angus already talked about it, especially on sustainable finance, how to finance a green recovery. And that module was then launched, and it's in biggest demand, I would say, at the moment. The other few things were bringing the UN system together at the country level, because even Page is 5 agencies, and I think it's been said, Page alone cannot deliver this. Next slide, please. So we were trying to work very closely with the UN system through the UN Resident Coordinator's Office in the country, so that the whole UN system comes together. But also then we created new partnerships, which was with, for example, Cambridge Econometrics. We are delivering together, let's say, with Go for SDGs. There are seed programs. There is NDC partnership. So if we can just consider that PAGE is supporting 20 countries, but together with all these partnerships, we can take it to regional and global level. And then NDC has already put in 29 additional countries, so we are covering about 49 countries. Though our support is very humble, and it doesn't mean that all the work will be done with what we are doing. So we need more partners definitely around that one. The last 2 points on the countries, that these are the 20 countries which we are supporting now. And we hope that, with our partnerships, we will be able to take it to regional levels, and especially Go for SDGs could play a role there, and also at the global level where other partners can come in and we work together. My last 2 messages are that I think measuring progress is another element that we are now seeing, that some countries are moving in that direction. We see increasing number of announcements for greening the recovery. How do we measure that? So we are now realigning our green economy measurement framework, and we will offer it to countries that if they want to use it, this is one tool. I'm sure there are many others. And then the capacity building, about which Angus has talked about a lot. The last thing I would like to say is that, yes, we need to continuously review and refine our approach, because things are changing. Initially, when we started, we were thinking that it will be a 3-month thing, and then we will get into recovery mode. But we see that, the pandemic is prolonging, its economic, employment, and social impacts are prolonging and getting worse. So we need to refine these methodologies, our tools, and our partnerships, and that's probably will take us forward. So these are some of the lessons, but I'll be happy to answer any questions that come from the audience. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you so much, Assad. It's a very powerful tour de force of where PAGE is working and making its contributions, humble as you say, but always open to new partnerships and expanding impact through working together. I think that's something that PAGE has done very well, and you've been a big part of that, and everyone who's contributed, including, of course, the European Union, Korea, and others, both materially and financially, and in spirit and intellectually, a joint enterprise. So there's a number of questions that have been rolling in the chat box, and I think everyone has access to them. What I'm going to do is actually double back now to you, Ambassador Kim, with one of the first sets of questions. And these can be fairly short, impromptu responses. There's 2 for you, Ambassador Kim. The first one is very specific. It's about the 2050 carbon neutrality pledge, and whether there's any thoughts of bringing that into law, making that a binding commitment within Korean legislation. And the second one that follows closely to that, which is about, in the Green New Deal, will there be a supporting scheme for workers and communities that might be negatively affected by green industries, such as those working in fossil fuel-based industries? I assume here the person is talking about the transition. How does Korea manage that transition, where some industries phase out and other industries phase in? So Ambassador Kim, over to you for your thoughts on these 2 questions.
Hello, Stevenson. If I respond to the first 2 questions, the 2050 net zero commitment is not incorporated in Korean law yet, because it was announced pretty recently. However, Korean National Assembly, because GGGI had a chance to organize like so-called net zero commitment seminar with Korean National Assembly, and parliamentary members, they are very well aware of that the National Assembly must support the effective implementation to achieve this goal. Therefore, I believe some actions at the level of National Assembly will follow. We will see what Korean government and National Assembly work together. And also, because Korea just announced its 2030 revised NDCs, these NDCs will be definitely incorporated in Korean law. Therefore, once Korea is going to legalize the 2030 target, and I think then Korea is going to take next step to really materialize 2050 carbon neutral goal. Responding to the second question, actually Korean New Deal includes very strong policies and actions regarding strengthening social safety nets, because Korea is pretty highly dependent on so-called energy-intensive industry. And a lot of Korean major industries, they are quite fossil fuel centered. Therefore, in the process of green transition, there are areas which will be negatively affected. Therefore, Korean government is allocating a huge amount of budget to support those people who will face difficult situations. So Green New Deal, Korean New Deal has two pillars, Green New Deal and Digital New Deal. However, both pillars are based on the foundation of strong social safety net policies.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. That is, it's very inspiring to hear the example from Korea. Many countries, of course, are struggling with these transitional issues. And this is not the first time we've seen Korea step up. Also, one of the leaders in the 2008-2009 recovery to make it greener. So thank you very much for sharing that. Thibaut, I'm going to come to you next. There's a question for you about the European Green Deal. This is from Elise Buckel. She says the European Green New Deal looks excellent on climate, excuse me, climate, energy, transport, education, and IT. She's asking, what about biodiversity and nature? Could you respond to her question, Thibaut?
Sure, yes, thanks for the question. So I think biodiversity in the Green Deal features quite prominently, like other pillars of the Green Deal, climate change, circular economy, food systems, for example. I think when it comes to the recovery plan, so I presented a few examples. The regulation establishing the recovery facility, and I think it's important to see that the Commission establishes the mechanisms, provides some guidance, but then it's the member states who develop their own plans based on a number of criteria and guidelines. So if you look at the regulation, yes, perhaps biodiversity is not referred to explicitly, but it's the same for other areas of the Green Deal. The regulation covers plenty of things, legal aspects, the process. Nevertheless, the commitment to the green transition and to the Green Deal is very clear. And in addition to the regulation, the Commission has produced some guidelines to support, to guide the development of the plans by member states. And there in the guidelines, you have very explicit references to biodiversity, including restoring ecosystems, for example, investing in nature-based solutions. Where you are right is at the end is the member states who develop the plans for the funding. So it would be important to watch this indeed. Thank you. We cannot hear you, Stephen, I'm afraid.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, how odd. Really having strange mind of its own, my microphone this morning. Yeah, as you were speaking, I was thinking also of the farm to fork strategy, which I believe is embedded in the Green Deal recovery, which to me had a very strong nature element to it as well. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yes, well, the biodiversity approach. So in the context of international cooperation, perhaps if I can focus on that, indeed, we see that the farm to fork approach, which we're also promoting the context of international cooperation, that's one of the main tools actually to support biodiversity, which is not so much, it's not just an area on its own. Of course, we have some initiatives focusing on areas such as what I just mentioned, ecosystem restoration, but it's also very much through investments and activities in other areas, the agriculture sector, forestry, for instance. So referring to the part I know best, international cooperation, indeed is very much embedded in our cooperation on agriculture, food security, rural development to integrate biodiversity considerations in this context.
Thanks very much, Thibaut. So we're getting a lot of last-minute questions coming in. So Thibaut, you might want to have a look at those and feel free to throw answers into the chat box as well. I'm going to, in the question of fairness, I'm going to go to Angus next. And Angus, we have a couple of questions coming from Africa about some of the things you've said. One is from Selby Suma. He said, you've said all the right things. Africa is always left behind. How do we partner with your organization to bridge the divide? And also, resources and capacity remain a challenge for us, NGOs in Africa. Partnership is strategic and valuable. How can that happen? How does that happen? How do you partner effectively with those who most need access to the resources, educational, that you're providing? Angus.
Yeah, thanks. And actually, I think the COVID crisis has exposed these issues even more starkly. I mean, it's not like they weren't there before, but I think perhaps one of the good things about 2020 is that we can see more clearly where the issues are, particularly for us in terms of effective transmission of new knowledge in ways that stick. There's quite an interesting report on this that I think has been launched this week, done by the University of London, I think it's Holloway College. And there's a very useful idea, which is when it comes to the transfer of knowledge, we should be technology agnostic. So what that means is that, don't assume that e-learning, for example, is going to provide the answer. It will provide the answer in some circumstances for some people. It would be very dangerous for us to project any other message. So we look at the context and we try to find the right transmission mechanism for that context. If you look at West Africa, for example, people are on the move, and really you're not going to get an awful lot of interest in desk-based courses. I mean, some people, but if you can't do something that is mobile, and it doesn't necessarily have to be on a smartphone. I mean, we're now experimenting with the use of podcasts, as I've said, but we also have provided support to national radio stations, and we're providing key messaging not only in English or French, but also in the primary additional national languages. So, we don't have time to go into this in detail, but we're acutely aware of the digital divide and how that may be expanding, and we encourage all actors to be technology agnostic when thinking about what's the right way of supporting, and in what particular context. Over.
Thank you very much, Angus. That is brilliant. And I'm thinking maybe you could drop into the chat box some of the links to resources that UNITAR provides under PAGE and under its other really interesting umbrella programs, such as Climate Change Learn and other resources. Sonia, I'm coming to you next. This is a question from Julie Benda. She said, trade is expected to play a crucial role in economic recovery from the pandemic. Is there scope for trade, and in particular, sustainable trade in biodiversity-based products, to play a role in nature-based recovery too? Sonia, your thoughts?
Absolutely. I think that trade will be an essential component of boosting the economy after COVID. And it must be steered in the right direction as the other investments too. I think that ensuring sustainable supply chains, benefiting those that are the producers at the local producers, and working, I think, in partnership with those that are working and breathing in and out sustainable trade practices, like the UNCTAD Biotrade or the Union for Ethical Biotrade and all the rest of it, and bringing their expertise in will be essential in pushing forward this nature-based recovery. Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Sonia. I also feel that trade is in one of these inflection points right now, because of course WTO has been almost paralyzed the last year. But there's a real resurgence in looking at trade governance and how you can make the normative framework for trade one that's conducive for sustainability and good outcomes for nature. And I think that's something that we all need to embrace, particularly with a new wave coming in, a new director general coming into WTO that's yet to be nominated. But these could change radically. So definitely something we'd like to look at with you. And also your work, Sonia, on looking at the impacts of different recovery packages, the nature impacts of those investments, I think, is something really, really interesting that we need to come back to and look more at what you're doing there.
Yeah, absolutely.
So a follow-on question for Asad, and then Vic, I'm going to let you wrap it up as chair of the Page Management Board. So Asad, I'll come to you next. This is a question for all panelists, but I think it's one that, Asad, you're uniquely placed to respond to. How do you see the interplay between targeted and sectoral investments in the context of recovery plans and more structural reforms, such as on sustainable finance, which should, when operational, channel investments in the right sector? So it's a very multifaceted, multicolored question, to use your phrase, Angus, and it's from Pascal Deslail. Asad, your thoughts on this?
Thank you, Stephen. I think this is really a fundamental question. And that's where we feel that, you know, the partnerships like Page can, together with other institutions, can play a bigger role. As we have seen in the past, that sometimes, you know, there are some sectors who are moving in, let's say, the green directions or inclusive directions, and others are not. And the overall impact, if we look at it over the last 10 years, has not been extremely positive, because if 90% of your economy is still business as usual and 10% is moving greener, even if, you know, some financial investments, the overall direction will take probably very long, or needle will probably not shift. And that's why, you know, Page has been focusing on, number one, macroeconomic policy reforms, creating an overall enabling environment which doesn't benefit one particular sector, but all sectors. And then it makes the level playing field between business as usual and a transition to green economy. So I can take the example of, let's say, fiscal reforms. We have been working on organic agriculture for a long time to promote it as an employment creation opportunity, as a carbon sequestration opportunity, as a biodiversity creation opportunity. But the world has not moved. The organic is still 3 to 4% of the total agriculture production and consumption patterns. And the reason for that is that, you know, the smallholder farmers in Africa cannot compete with $1 trillion or $1 billion subsidies for agriculture every day, which is for basically chemical fertilizers and pesticides. And that's why the policy coherence comes in. And that's where I see that, you know, the approach that we are trying to take is possibly a useful one, that it is not the environmental policy which will make the shift. It's probably the employment policy, it's the economic growth policy, it's the finance and financial sector regulators, and it is probably the enterprise and industrial development policy under the competitiveness. When they come together, probably we will see a bigger shift on a transition towards greening of economy. So that's how I see the link between sectors and the enabling frameworks.
Yeah, thanks, Asad. And your views on sort of the transitional space, in addition to the initial stimulus, the packages that are being rolled out, the spending, how do you see the follow-on reforms, fiscal, financial, agricultural, labor, to follow through and make that money really useful in a longer term?
So thank you. So both things are important. Number one, you know, if we look at the amount of money which is now on the table for recovery, that is far more than what we needed for achieving the SDGs. So the first thing is that this money is used properly and in the right direction, because as management board of Page said very early on, this will be decisive if the future threats, whether from climate or biodiversity losses, are amplified or mitigated. Similarly, on the social inequality side and the inequality between countries, that's very important. So Secretary General has said that while there are trillions of dollars being allocated, only 2% of this is moving between borders. So those countries who have higher level of resources, they will probably come out early, they will probably come out better, could also be greener. But then those who do not have, it's possible that the gap between have and have-nots will increase as a result of this. So that's where I think the right use of the stimulus packages, which is green and inclusive, and I'll emphasize the inclusive part, is important. And then having the right policy designs in place, which makes sure that the follow-up investments or financial flows, both from public and private sector, reinforce what is created through these green recovery packages.
Very good point you're making, Asad. I remember somebody that we work with very closely saying that COVID was like pulling a curtain back on social inequalities. And Vic, you've also mentioned this. Vic, I'm going to come to you with the last question, and it's one that follows very well from what Assad has just put on the table. This is from Pradeep Matthew. He says, I would like to hear your view on the challenging aspects that the impact of COVID-19 will create on the economies of developing nations, and especially those in Africa and Asia, especially as the COVID-19 economic impact might be restricting investments in green industry and more broadly. Vic, over to you for your response.
Thank you. I think what we're finding is in Asia and Africa, in the developing economies, is that often the economic hardship is far bigger than the health crisis that is being posed by COVID. If you look at the numbers globally, you'll find that Africa in particular is way down proportionately to the rest of the world. But the economic hardship that they suffered far before they hit the COVID figures was of huge proportions. And that had to do with the developing economies focusing on looking after themselves and making sure they can deal with the crisis appropriately. And so what has happened is in the developing economy, they've had to turn to implementing stimulus packages to keep jobs, to keep enterprises functioning, and to just deal with the daily crises that they are faced with. This has led to them taking a focus off the green element because of the issues that are on their plate. And this is a challenge. So how do we deal with this going forward? And that's where we continually hear the slogan, build back better and greener. The greener component only came in after a lot of thought given to how we need to look at the future. But in order to attract investment back into the developing economies, they're going to have to deal with this in a holistic way. There's a number of factors that often in these countries aren't in place. A few years ago, 2 years ago, I attended a meeting in the ASEAN countries, the World Economic Forum, and it was very good to see how the countries in that sub-region had come together and worked together across borders in coming up with a strategy for a sub-region that was placing them on the economic growth path that would attract foreign investment. Well, that is what is needed more so now than ever from across the developing world. And in Africa and Asia, and particularly in Africa, we're going to have to recognize, and I come from Africa, we're going to have to recognize the realities of not working only within a country, but working in a sub-region and coming up with a rule of law, a political stability, a stability in leadership, education systems that are lagging behind. So it's not just coming up with one statement and saying, give me money to fix up the green economy. The investors are looking for a package that cuts across people, societies, the economy, and the environment. And those countries that can come up with this holistic plan will find that the investors will look at them more favorably than elsewhere. And the only way that Africa and the Asian development countries are going to move is with foreign direct investment. There isn't sufficient at the local level to stimulate that economic recovery. I think we also need to recognize that process is equally important as content. And at national levels, we need to look at the involvement of not only government and not only looking to government, but we need to focus in on the private sector and how can the private sector play a key role, as well as the social partners from the worker side when we're talking from the ILO perspective, but also societies and leadership there. So yes, I think there's a collective leadership, there's a process to be dealt with, and it's not an easy path. But those developing economies that are going to come up, as I think Assad pointed out to some of these important factors, a national policy coherence, national strategy, and look to pulling in countries around them in their region, that for me would be a recipe to start getting investment in, much needed investment to deal with these issues, including the environment. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Vic. Really, really important points, and taking us right to the end of our Q&A session. I'm tempted to say as we wrap up, first of all, we've had some really important insights in the course of the past hour and 20 minutes or so forth. And Vic, you put on the table of going beyond slogans, but also the importance of capturing our thoughts, building forward, better and greener. And I think also, Angus, you spoke about some of the structural changes between the last time we got hit with a major recession and financial crisis, which was 2008, 2009, and this one resulting from the lockdown. And those are, the private sector is awake, finance is awake, youth is very much mobilized, governments are mobilized, and the cost structures are changing because of innovation. And if there's one or two take-home points that I have from this conversation today, it is our way to innovate in the face of necessity. It is to learn from the past and innovate and be creative about our ways forward. I'd like to end my remarks here before handing it back to you, Diana, if you have any housekeeping or final remarks, with a big thank you to our panelists who shared their thoughts, their wisdom, their experience today, to those who have joined us, and also to you, Diana, from the Geneva Environment Network for hosting our session today. Thank you, and over to you, Diana.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And indeed, thank you to all the panelists. Thank you for doing this excellent moderation. And thank you for who has joined us and attended this session. All the presentations that were made, as well as the links that were the tools that you referred to throughout the presentation, will be added to the webpage of this event, where you can already find also the video of the event, and where you will find later the summary of this event. We are very happy to close the year discussing how a green recovery could look like, and specifically with the colleagues who join us today on the panel. With that, we also want to share with you our season's greetings, and we hope to have you all back next year. And happy again, Stephen, to engage with your teams and with the teams of all the panelists that were with us today from next year.